All I want to do in this lecture is just to do a quick recap that will help summarize what we've been talking about throughout the course. I found helpful when we think about wisdom literature as a whole, and this is from Proverbs chapter 21 in verse 31. The proverb says, "The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but victory belongs to the Lord." That proverb encapsulates precisely what wisdom literature is all about. And there are two dimensions of wisdom literature that is described in the two lines of the song. First is the horse is prepared for battle. This describes the reality of the world as it is, creation. Then part of creation is that it's the way the world works, and we learn how to live in the world, how to make use of God's creation. So the preparing of the horse for battle, you could describe it as maybe secular, maybe non-religious. And by secular, I don't mean necessarily that God doesn't exist, but it's living and behaving without an explicit acknowledgement of God. So when the horse is getting ready for battle, there's not an explicit religious ritual or praying. It's just ordinary secular activities of feeding the horse, brushing the horse, putting the armor on the horse, getting the horse ready for battle. So that is maybe called a natural way of looking at the world. There's a natural component. The second line says, "Victory belongs to the Lord," it's an equal affirmation that of the reality of God, that God has created the world, and that God has created the world in a way that God's involvement is also part of the world. So that one proverb holds that equally true two views. One is a natural view. This is how the world works, and we can live and operate in this world with the natural mindset without an explicit mentioning of God. The other view is theological. It affirms that God is at work in this world, that God is working through us as Christians and continue to work in the future until Jesus returns. Now, what's essential to understand wisdom literature is the holding of both as equally true. They're not contradictory. The term that describes this is the term dialectic. And you may have encountered this aspect of dialectic before. It is a very, 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 very difficult term to understand and has not been explained very well. So I'm going to do my best to simplify and explain what the term dialectic means. Basically, what dialectic means is to hold as equally true two views that may contradict each other or mutually exclusive. You hold two different views as as equally true, two different views. That's what we mean by dialectic. I'll give you an example. Dialectic is actually a really common concept in psychotherapy, and one common intervention for psychotherapy is called dialectical behavior therapy. And dialectical behavior therapy attempts to communicate two different views as both true. And this comes out in the view of number one is acceptance. Accept who you are. That's one view. The second is change. Advocating and setting goals of things you want to change. And so you hold both as true. You accept who you are, but accept that there are things about you that might need to change. Okay, so in wisdom literature, as a dialectic, they hold as true both the natural way the world works, creation theology, and on the other hand, that God is also at work in the world. This is theology. Wisdom literature holds both, but wisdom literature also affirms that there is a time that you could do one without reference to the other, and then you can do the other without reference, to the one. One example with childbearing. Okay, so if we apply this dialectic understanding that wisdom literature is trying to convey to childbearing, when we read the Psalm, we read the theological view that God is involved in the birth of a child. And in one of the Psalms describes God kind of like as a weaver, someone that knits. And so the life that's being formed in the womb is explained as God knitting, God is creating a human being. That theological claim shows God actually in the process of creating the child. Okay, but the natural view of getting pregnant and giving birth to a child um, is in the arena of medicine and is in the arena of science. So obviously today, when a child is being born, both are held as equally true for a couple that are Christian. So even though there is an affirmation that God is in the process of knitting and is overseeing, and you pray to God to protect the child, that does not deny the validity of using the best science available to ensure a safe childbirth. So the whole birthing process itself could be done without an explicit reference to God, and wisdom literature says, yeah, that's good. You can hold both as equally true. Okay, so that's the concept of the psalm to understand both. And then with that in mind, what I want to do is walk us through maybe the main conclusions that wisdom literature is trying to make that we can take away from this course here. So on the theological side, about God, one thing the wisdom literature makes really clear is we are created, we are finite, and we do not have a transcendent absolute view of reality because we are creator. As creator, our view of God, our view of reality is going to be limited, going to be conditional. And all three books of wisdom literature, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, drive that point home that we are limited in how we can understand God. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, God is in heaven, you are on earth. Let your words be few. Watch your step. Watch how you live as you enter the house of God. God is in heaven, you are on earth. And of course, with Job, the dramatic appearance of God as a whirlwind to Job, and in the final speech God gives Job, where were you, Job, when I created the earth? And so at the end of Job, God reveals reality. Job, you are limited, you are not God, and you don't see the big picture. And because we don't see the big picture, we cannot make definitive, absolute claims about justice. Because, as we learned in the class, justice requires having all the information. Since we do not have all the information about how the world works, we do not have the authority or the insight to definitively proclaim justice in the world. As a matter of fact, all we can say is the world as we know it is not run by justice, and that's a good thing. Jesus confirms this when Jesus says the rain falls on both the just and the unjust. Our whole weather system does not depend on being fair or not in terms of individuals. So Job really drives home the view you are human, you are limited in your knowledge. Yeah. Yeah. And then what that means about God, we are limited in how we can view God, though we cannot systematize God completely to have God all figured out. We cannot put God in a box and be definitive in saying this is who God is. And if we can definitively say that we know everything there is to know about God, and if we are completely confident in the judgment we make on others and on how the world works, doesn't that make us superior to God? And then if that's the case, then God is not transcendent. God is not God. But the wisdom literature emphasizes God transcendent. God is creator. God is in heaven. Therefore, our knowledge is limited, and we cannot systematize God. But the main point is not to have systematized knowledge, but to have a relationship with God, to speak rightly to God, okay, to affirm that God created the world as it is, that God is involved in the world, and that we will never know completely how that works. So that's the one side of wisdom literature, is the theological side. Okay? Victory belongs to the Lord. God is involved. But at the same time, wisdom literature affirms very clearly the natural side. There's an aspect where you get the horse ready, you allow science to have its say, so that we can engage in a natural way of living without an explicit view of God. So wisdom literature says, for example, yes, enjoy your food and your drink, enjoy life, enjoy relationship. Okay, enjoy the here and now. It doesn't all have to be directly reflective of God or about God. I mean, I would have people come to me in guilt thinking, oh, I enjoy, playing sport. I enjoy, doing theater, things like that. But I feel guilty because it's not Christian, it's not spiritual. I think what that person was really saying is, I, my view of spirituality is what we do in church. It is explicit dedication of everything to God. But when I do theater, when I play sport, watching a movie that doesn't make a reference to God, I think that I feel that that's not biblical, and maybe I shouldn't be doing those things. And then to help us address that issue is to affirm what the wisdom literature gives the stamp of approval on just doing natural things, because that is spiritual. Having a meal with someone, sitting at a table, eating breakfast, drinking coffee, just shooting the breeze, it's a very deeply spiritual activity, even if God is not referenced. That explains why there's books like Song of Songs. God is not mentioned once in the entire book of Psalms in an unambiguous manner. As a side note, there is one phrase that uses the Hebrew word Yah that some might think translates God near the end, but it's not a clear reference to God. But you read Song of Songs, God's not mentioned. But what did that say about sexuality, about communion and intimacy with a significant other? That's highly spiritual, highly profound. Why? Well, that's wisdom, but also note the connection Song of Songs makes to Genesis, the creation account of Adam and Eve and in the garden. The Song of Songs uses the image of a garden, the fruit, and the Song of Songs uses actual quotation from the creation account to show that the companionship and the intimacy that's shared between the human couple is rooted in the theology of creation at the start of the Bible in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Okay? You can also remember the book of Esther that some have also considered like wisdom in a narrative setting, and Esther doesn't reference God at all. Okay, so that wisdom literature affirmed its natural way of living. So doing natural things is spiritual. Going to Starbucks, spending time with someone is a deeply spiritual activity. And that's something that we need to claim because we tend to limit to spirituality only that which is God, which is divine. But that's a Gnostic view that is heretical if you really affirm the Bible as a whole. And Christians had to really work to overcome Gnosticism in the early church. But that concept of Gnosticism, I think, is really the basis of our DNA here. If we feel guilty about doing things that are not completely spiritual, yeah. So think of a dialectic. Wisdom literature says reality is a dialectic. We can affirm that God is at work. We can affirm that the nature is at work, that there is a natural order to things, and we don't have to refer to God. Both are equally true. How can both things be true? We are incapable of understanding that unless we are as transcendent as God. And so the Paul uses that metaphor of seeing through a glass darkly. We can see some things that are true, like through a dark mirror, but we won't be able to see clearly face to face until we become more like God. So, the takeaway from wisdom literature that's really important for us to understand is that reality is a dialectic. And so that's why dialogue is fundamental to living in the world today. So what I want to do is call attention to looking at all three books in the framework of dialogue. When I say dialogue, I'm using a term very specific. I'm going to post a link to the document here. But there's a document that describes the differences between debate, discussion, and dialogue. When we talk about a debate is an argument where you're right, the other person is wrong, and the task is to convince the other person that they're wrong and that you're right, and the goal is to win. Okay, so is baseball better than basketball? Is my dad better than your dad? Those kind of things are debates, okay? And debate does have a place in areas where things are not up for discussion, okay? But the second discussion is more of a give and take where you're working to figure something out that you haven't figured out yet. But discussion tends to be more content focused and not holistic. So a family discussing where to go for dinner or how to budget and make difficult choices, things like that. It's trying to explore options. It's more cognitive and cerebral. But dialogue, and the goal for dialogue is to create a community where we're all interconnected. Dialogue is engagement of our whole self with the whole self of someone else, cognitive, emotional, our affect, and everything. And dialogue, we seek to understand others, where they're coming from. We seek to explain ourselves so that we can be understood. And the goal is to find common ground, but the common ground may only be I understand you where you're coming from. I don't agree with that, but I understand it. And you understand where I'm coming from. And even though you don't agree with it, you understand it. Therefore, we can be in communion. We can relate to one another, agree to disagree, but realizing that we may never come to an agreement without attaining transcendence because we're limited. Because we're limited, I yearn to relate to you as much as I can. this is really common, especially with religious differences. So, for example, I'm part of a society that's primarily Catholic. The Catholics created an association for biblical studies called Catholic Biblical Association, and it's somewhat ecumenical. We have Jews, we have Catholics, we have Church of Christ, we have people from all over. And what's interesting is even though the views of Catholics are incompatible with views with Christian churches of Christ and other stuff, or even though it's compatible, they all get together for serious academic Bible study in a way that's affirming. And one of the highlights of the association for the annual meeting is the food and drink. That's what they really want to do is to enjoy the fellowship. And so I've been going to Catholic Biblical Association national meeting for a few years, and it's all centered around eating food in the cafeteria, and then all centered around drinking and fellowship. And if that wasn't possible, they wouldn't even meet. But at the same time, the Catholic community makes it very clear that there are things that separate us. And so when they have worship and have Mass, they make it very clear that Mass is only for Catholics, but they yearn for a time where we can be unified. But that's the idea of dialogue, is attempting to relate and to connect different voices, different perspectives that don't always match up, but to hold them together with the view that there might be ways that we can find common ground. But even if we can't, we affirm the dignity, the humanity of everyone involved. And the philosophy of how this should shape our everyday life um, it's critical to get and to understand because we're becoming polarized more than ever before to the point where it's very difficult to even have a polite conversation with family members, with friends, without breaking up into a debate, into a shouting match. And so a lot of times what happens is there's a debate going on that's about winning, and then we're not getting along well with each other. Because I've observed families where one person wants to do a dialogue, they want to be understood, and they're not trying to change your mind, but they're trying to um, reach out and make connection, while the other person just wants to win and they just want to debate. And so often when we engage in conversation, there are different goals, different motivations. Some are just debating, some are there for dialogue, some might be for discussion, and then it turns out into an intractable quagmire where in the end we're learning that it's just better to be isolated. It's just better to wall ourselves off. We can be polite. We can talk about, the weather, about sports, entertainment, but we're no longer going to touch um, issues that we used to be able to talk about in the past. That's really unfortunate because what wisdom literature teaches us is the reality of the world today is, you know, we all are going to have different views and we really don't know ultimately what life is all about in one form or another. That's why Proverbs has a lot of proverbs that are contradictory because view it dialectical. Proverbs will say in one place, do this, and then the next verse, do the opposite. Why? Because reality is complex and complicated. There are different ways to view things. It's just a really funny kind of understanding of proverb in American proverb. There was a comedian that said, talked about the proverb, something like slow and steady win the race. And the comedian said his aunt always told him growing up, slow and steady win the race. Slow and steady win the race. I think my aunt died in a house fire. Okay, so in a house fire, slow and steady does not apply. So proverbs are limited. We always hear early bird gets the worm, Okay, that's true, but that always true? Consider another proverb. The late mouse gets the cheese. Think about that. An early mouse, get trapped, and with the trap already sprung, it's the late mouse that gets the cheese. So there are times where it pays to be early. There's a time that will pay off if you're more deliberate, if you're more intentional. Don't be so concerned about time. So life is the myth. Life can be contradictory, and wisdom literature says that is exactly right. Because if we have life all figured out neatly, we have God figured out. We have the world figured out. That will never happen. So humility is the value that we need to get out of wisdom literature, and then ultimately awe. Because the one theme about God that all the books of wisdom literature reflected is the attitude in the English translation is fear. Fear, fear of God. So Proverbs, fear of God is the beginning of knowledge. Like Ecclesiastes, God is in heaven, you are on earth, therefore fear God. Job is described as a person who fears God. Here's the problem. Remember, translation is just an interpretation of the Hebrew. But the word fear is not something to mean to be always scared, but maybe something like to be in awe of something. When you're in the presence of the transcendent and you are lost for words, it's that feeling. When you look at the stars and you see trillions of stars out there, I'm just a speck, that's awe. You see a tree that's 4,000 years old, Bristlecone Pine, California, 4,000 years old. You mean that these trees were little green saplings like Grogu about 1,000, 2,000 years before Jesus was born. And when Jesus was born, the tree was this high. That's awe. When we look at the quantum realm and we see particles, and we still haven't hit a wall yet. How small can we go to find reality? That's all. I remember 3 parts of your atom. Now there's probably hundreds of particles out there. If you've seen the Ant-Man movie where Ant-Man gets really tiny and in a dangerous state in the quantum realm. But we don't know where the limit is in terms of the microverse, how small we get, or the macroverse. And it just overwhelms us. That's all. How can things be created? I mean, have you ever thought about that? How did we come to be? How can something just come into existence from nothing? We can't conceive of that because we're limited. I mean, all I can get out of that is just awe. Wow, we are here. Have you ever thought about that? Because our lives, it's based around cause and effect. There is no effect without a cause. That's how we see the world. But then how can the universe be created? Because you cannot have an effect without a cause. So if there was nothing, what caused it come to being? We say God, but we cannot comprehend reality where there is something that is not caused. That's all. And that's the point that wisdom literature wants to drive home. When we can finally get that awe, that humility, we can then learn what it really means to live, because the awe, the humility allows us to live life in a way that we don't have a handle on reality, but there are some things we can know. And that's the other thing wisdom literature tells. Here are some things we can know. There is a God, we can know that. We can know that the God is relational. God invites us to speak, to lament to God. We can know the natural world is very good. We can eat and drink and enjoy everything about life, even if it's not explicitly related to God. That's in an opposite contrast to some religious views where creation in the world is an illusion. We need to wake up from this illusion. And things like food and drink and relationship is trapping us. Very different view. The wisdom literature says we can enjoy life. We can know there is a God. We can speak to this God. And so the takeaway is this: not having all the answers, that's not a challenge of faith. We may feel pressured, especially in churches of Christ, if we exclusively focus on knowledge, on the analytical, rational thinking of God. We may feel there's something wrong with us if we don't have all the answers. But not having all the answers is not a challenge of faith. That is what faith is all about. It's knowing we don't have all the answers, knowing we're limited, and we have to be content with being limited. That's faith. While we continue to grow in knowledge. So that's the dialectic. We have to accept reality is limited. Our knowledge is limited. But we accept that. But we also accept the fact we can continue to grow and learn. That's why you're here in class. My hope is you've learned something that you haven't learned before. But it's not going to undo the other affirmation that we're limited in knowledge. That's the dialectic. Okay? Faith means we're limited. We don't have all the answers. And then here's the kicker: allowing other viewpoints to be heard, giving a place for views that we don't agree with. It's not a threat to faith. That is what faith is all about. Faith means because we're limited, we're going to privilege inclusivity of views because each view will contribute something to reality. And I want you to see how wisdom literature works very carefully to ensure different viewpoints are related. Job, we have dialogue between Job and Job's friends of different viewpoints. Then Elihu comes, and then God comes, and then we have the book of Job. So it facilitates different points of view. Proverbs has different proverbs that contradict one another, different points of view. Okay, Ecclesiastes, there are sections of Ecclesiastes that contradict one another if you read it. But if you think of a dialogue, that's fine. Ecclesiastes says a time for war, but time for peace. That's the dialectic. A time to hug, a time to not hug, a time to tear down, a time to build. Those are dialectic. And Ecclesiastes says what wisdom is knowing the times, okay? What time is it now to do what needs to be done? Okay, then that's it. Even if it's different from a different time, acting what time it is and entering that time fully is what wisdom is all about. But it doesn't end there, because we see, like in Lamentation, hearing the voices of those going through trauma, the pain, that there's comfort, that there is no comfort. Who will comfort us? And then Lamentations ends with that. But then that functions as the Bible as a whole, where we have dialogue. Song of Songs refers to the garden in Genesis. Song of Songs rests on the foundation of Genesis, with a couple enjoying their relationship. We talked about Job, when God gives Job a tour of the wild animals, that is in dialogue with Adam. In Adam, we have domesticated animals. In Adam, the center, the animals are brought to Adam. In Job, it's the opposite. Job is shown all the wild animals that remain in their domain, that Job, out of Job's element. So creation is wild. Creation is also domesticated and good, and for humans, both are true. So we have a dialogue with Job, with Genesis, Song of Songs with Genesis. Lamentation, for example, says, who's going to comfort me? It's tragic. But then if you look at Isaiah chapter 40 through 55, that section of Isaiah has a very distinct profile that is poetry in the form of drama, and very distinct, that most scholars will outline that part of Isaiah separately. But Isaiah 40 appear to reflect knowledge of lamentation because this is the exile coming home. You know what Isaiah says? Comfort my people. Comfort. And the time of sin, the time of trauma is over. You're coming home. And they also uses the image of Jerusalem, okay, of Zion. And so we see Isaiah as a dialogue with lamentation. And so then it helps us understand the Bible better because here's why. The books in the Bible are not selected just for knowledge. The books in the Bible are selected to interact with one another. Okay, so that dialogue there. We read Song of Songs, we think of Genesis, and then Lamentation to Isaiah. Isaiah leads us to Jesus, to the church, and all the books are interrelated in dialogue, and then that's how we are to live our life. So we are challenged to allow viewpoints to be heard, to affirm the integrity of other points of view. Yeah. And then finally, because it's limited, our view of life is limited, we're always going to struggle with faith. We're always going to struggle with unbelief because that's part of faith. If we are limited, then we don't have 100% assurance of anything, really. We can know a lot of things, but we cannot know everything there. So we have to be content with limitation, and that involves, at the same time, affirming something. I'm not sure if we affirm others. And in the Gospel, the Father expressed it really well when Jesus asked about faith, when he said, I believe, but help my unbelief. That's wisdom leadership right there. Yeah, we believe things, but we are limited, and it's always going to be a struggle, a process to learn, to think, and to enjoy life. You know. So that's kind of my takeaway for wisdom literature that I hope will help you continue on after this course. And bottom line is, God created the world. When we look at the world, we see it in awe. Every day you are all exposed to creation, with our body, with our surroundings, with nature, with people, and it's awe that God has given us these gifts to enjoy. And it's a testimony of this greater reality that by faith we accept to define what it means to live in relationship with God and with others. Well, no, a lot more can be said, but Ecclesiastes, to adapt Ecclesiastes, much lecturing, much video editing, and teaching is weary for the body. So it is time to end the class. However, dialogue always goes on, and I want you to know and to be empowered to continue to dialogue. So please do reach out to me at any time as needed. I enjoy good dialogue anytime, anywhere. And so my hope is you continue this dialogue and reach out to me anytime you want to. Reach out to your family, to your church community, to your neighbor in the spirit of dialogue, because we are all created in the image of God. We are all created to live and to enjoy life at God's creation. So, horses prepare for battle, victory belongs to God. You can understand those two, not complete, have it figured out, but starting to get it, then we're starting to get wisdom literature. And it never ends, because our relationship with God and each other is dynamic, and it continues on and on and on. So it's been a pleasure, and may God bless you in your future studies here at Harding. And adios.